to Earth Day 2018, Discovery Green Park. We're about to have our next Earth Talk. I want to introduce to you a speaker. He's a professor at Rice University. He's a research scientist. He's a lecturer on sustainability. He's going to be talking about floodplain management, balancing the natural environment and human needs. His name is Dr. Lester King. He's nationally certified sustainability planner, dedicated educator here in the United States. As I mentioned, he's over at Rice University. He specializes in developing enhancement strategies for urban development, certified skilled planner, expertise in community development, public health planning, master planning, environmental planning, sustainability planning. This guy's got some plans. Please give it up for Dr. Lester King.
Thank you, Dwayne. Thank you. I'm going to move the mic over here so I can be closer to my son Aiden, and I'll be talking to you guys a little bit about. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Is it better? Okay, so I should just yell into the microphone, I guess. Oh, right, like this. So I wanted to start off my talk with a little joke. So this morning, I was having breakfast with a retired NASA engineer and a retired radiologist. And I told him I was going to have this event. And it was this big Earth Day event, and we were going to be talking about protecting the environment. And my talk was going to be on sustainable development and the floodplains. And they all perked up, and their eyes got really gleamy, and they started to smile and gave me the option to start the talk. So I did. And about maybe 2 minutes into the conversation, the radiologist got up and went for some more eggs at the buffet. And I thought, okay, that's okay. You know, I'll wait till he comes back because I'm sure he's interested. And then he comes back, and I continue to talk. And the retired NASA engineer starts to tell me about what he knows with regards to the Mississippi River and what happens with New Orleans with regards to the Mississippi River. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I want to tell you about my talk. So if you could just listen for 1 second about my talk, we'll be good. And so I started talking a little bit more. And then another retired guy. Yes, it's true. I have breakfast almost every morning with retired people. So this retired accountant says, what are you talking about? So I told him, and I turned away for just 1 second to explain that to him. When I turned back, the radiologist was having another conversation with somebody else on a different topic. So it was like, okay, it's just me and the engineer. We're going to have a talk. But then he starts to argue with me about the Mississippi and New Orleans, and it's very important that we understand how that compares with Houston. So then, of course, I had to pull up my phone to talk about Cairo in Egypt, which is completely different than where I had started. But I wanted to mention that to you because this is something that I deal with on a day-to-day basis. The topic of sustainable development is a topic that has to do with our daily lives. And as a result, everyone should have an opinion. And everybody does have an opinion. And so it's very hard for professionals to get out there and say, you know, we know what to do, we can help you. And in fact, we really don't want to take that position. What we'd like to do is to share the information that we know so we can help you frame your own perspectives and your own livelihoods in a different way. So I'll start by this question of what is sustainable development? And then a corollary question to that is, why should anyone care, right? Why should this radiologist care about this? So sustainable development is coined back in 1987, which is what, 17 years after Earth Day started? So sustainable development, the biggest mantra, the most well-known mantra, the one that has the most bucks behind it and the most leaders behind it. Those of you who heard the mayor talking, he mentioned sustainable development and the fact that he considers that to be the hallmark of his Office of Environmental Stewardship. Sustainable development came around in 1987, and the definition is development which meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their own needs. And so, why should anyone care about that, right? We should care because sustainable development is really this framework for how we should live our lives, and it also addresses the management and maintenance of the environmental context of our communities, cities, and planet. So the rest of my talk is going to be basically a frame for how the definition of sustainability can help us to be able to articulate what's happening with our floodplains. And specifically, I'll be talking about the Brays Bayou floodplain and the Buffalo Bayou floodplain within the context, again, of sustainable development. So within that definition I just gave you, what we have is this idea of development versus growth. So sustainable development is development, right? It's not growth. And the difference there is the difference between quality and quantity, where development is meant to constitute a focus on quality, as opposed to growth, which is meant to constitute a focus on quantity. We have the concept of needs versus wants, right? The needs of the present generation instead of the wants of the present generation. So how do we come to decide what the needs are for people in Houston versus people in Pakistan or somewhere else in the world? We can reach back to Maslow, Abraham Maslow, who helped to coin what we consider to be needs today. He died in 1970, which is right about the time when we had the first Earth Day. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. The third frame is this sense of the present generation versus future generations. And so we want intergenerational equity. I'm here joined by my son, Aiden, and the first speaker today was a group of girls. And I thought that was very appropriate because they immediately started and had the crowd all riled up and really got us thinking that our future generations are engaged and are being educated with regards to, again, what we might call environmental stewardship and social responsibility. And then the fourth frame that I'll talk to you about is the 3 pillars of sustainability, which really is this concept of balancing social interests with economic interests and environmental interests. And again, I'll be talking about this around the context of our bayous. So this first frame, quantity versus quality, it really is the difference between sustainable development, by the way, was not started by environmentalists. It was started by economists who really wanted to get at moving our focus on money-driven or monetary-driven economies and more into economies that could be sustained over time. And so they looked at things like our GDP, gross domestic product, and found that it was wanting. You know, the GDP, if we look at GDP for Houston for last year, most people would assume, well, our city took a big hit because of Harvey, so our GDP is probably not going to look that great. Well, those of you who think that would probably be wrong, because the GDP doesn't really care about where the money was spent. The GDP just cares about how much money was spent. So if a lot of money comes into this city, and if a lot of our philanthropies have to put money into rebuilding, then that will add to the GDP and make us actually look better performing than we know we really are. And so what we really need is a sense of a monetary index, which will calculate as negative those monies that would go into, for instance, disaster resilience or things like trying to shore up our communities against other hazards. And so that would be a more honest approach to our city's economic success, because quite frankly, again, these are monies that could have gone into things like education or healthcare to improve other areas, but we had to spend it on hurricane response. And the next area that we would look at is, questions around the number of people impacted by the storm. Again, quantity versus quality. We want to see ordinances that are reflective of, again, that quality as opposed to the quantity. We know that our city has approximately 2.3 million people here. Well, a lot of you should know that we also have about 25% of the city land area within the 100-year floodplain. Again, that's 25% of the city of Houston people living within the 100-year floodplain, and that constitutes about 20%, a quarter of the land area within the floodplain and 20% of the people. And those are people that are directly affected, again, by this issue that we're talking about with regards to resilience from the flooding. So how about design guidelines in addition to the well-intended effort of the 2 feet above 500-year floodplain ordinance? My response to that is this is a very, what our honorable mayor has done was to add a very important element, which is based on numbers, again, based on the quantity, and it satisfies FEMA's need to understand that the city is doing something and then can continue funding or flood insurance. But with regards to quality, we need to look at things like having design guidelines for how people should be building, how that 20% of Houstonians should be building within that 100-year floodplain, and how they can maximize their quarter acre of land, and how they can balance the economic and environmental benefits. How about things like addressing resilient building materials? How are we going to do things like that? How about access to real-time intelligence so that we could understand exactly where and when the flooding is occurring, even for routine rainfalls numbers that we have? And then how about elimination of toxic and hazardous spills that routinely happen when our wastewater treatment plants are inundated, again, within these communities that are within the 100-year floodplain? So these are just a few of the kind of considerations that we can look at with regards to the quantity versus quality element within the definition of sustainability. The next frame is the frame of this idea of needs versus wants. Who am I to stand here telling people what they need and what they want? So we had a psychologist, again, Abraham Maslow, who put some thought into it, and he decided, you know what, I'm going to go study the 1% top people in the world, and I'm going to try to, through that lens, understand what are the things that have made them successful. And he did. And he's created this frame that most of us understand and most of us can relate to. And the frame basically says that if you look at a triangle, think of this hierarchy as a triangle. In the bottom, you have physical needs articulated. Above the idea of having physical needs would be the idea of having safety. Above that would be the idea of having love and community. Then esteem, and then self-actualization. But really what he was getting at is we can't get to self-actualization unless we address our physical needs and our safety, which are the two lowest rungs on Abraham Maslow's hierarchy. And so within the flooding context, we have a lot of our neighbors who are currently experiencing trauma. And a lot of them who are not experiencing trauma still feeling vulnerable. And so physically, we are not safe. We don't feel safe. And if that's the case, we're actually going to be compromising our city's ability and our kids, their ability to be successful, to move to the higher level, which is thinking about personal love and which is about thinking about community relations. Unless people can address their immediate housing needs, they're not going to be able to engage socially. We're not going to have strong social capital in this city. And certainly we're not going to achieve self-actualization, which is, making sure that our kids can get into Harvard and can be successful entrepreneurs, owning successful maintenance shops or plumbing or building houses. We're not going to be able to do that unless we address these fundamental levels. I applaud the mayor's Complete Communities effort under this particular idea of needs and wants, because this is something new for the city. And it's the idea of planning at the community level. Again, it is at that level where we can actually see our neighbors, and together we can agree on the things that are important in those living spaces, such as parks and access and having happy kids. So not all communities are within the pool of the mayor's Complete Communities effort. There are only 5 of them. But back in 1996, Mayor Brown divided up the city into 88 communities. And so that's a lot of communities that are currently not being addressed. And it's for that reason that a team of colleagues and I got together, colleagues representing Rice University, Texas Southern University, and the University of Houston, and we agreed that we will supplement we will complement what the city is doing with the Complete Communities effort, by also adding this sense of planning for resilience at the community's level. And so we're starting with the Meyerland community, and we're also working concurrently with a community out in the unincorporated area of Harris County called North Shore. We're doing this because we see the opportunity for our education institutions to contribute. And we can contribute where there is no market model for this, and where, again, city staff is not enough to complement the needs of our city with regards to having 88 different communities happening at the same time. With regards to present and future generations, this sense of intergenerational equity, and you have to excuse me for all the technical jargon because as much as I try to, I can't get away from it. Unfortunately, that's how my brain is wired. Let's talk about our kids and our present and future generations. We're talking about long-term planning, are we not? If we were to think about long-term planning, then what should our city look like in 2036? In 2036, the city of Houston will celebrate its 200th birthday. That's in about 17 years, approximately. And what should we do now to prepare for that? Would an ordinance saying that we should build 2 feet above the 500-year floodplain also be adequate in 17 years? Because, quite frankly, that ordinance was based as a response to something that already happened. Harvey has already happened. And if we start doing long-term projections for hydrology and flood planning, then we should probably be thinking about something higher than Harvey, which again occurred in the past, and we need to perhaps plan for the future. Brays Bayou was channelized back in 1955, and it was channelized at the same time that the community of Meyerland had first started. The community of Meyerland first settled around that same time. Therefore, that project was meant to address that community as it was back in 1950s. And we all know the community is very different today. So, again, this is planning as a response for the past, but how would planning in terms of the future actually look? Buffalo Bayou, on the other hand, is more of a bayou that is natural, and it was not channelized. And so if we are comparing Buffalo Bayou to Brays Bayou with regards to sustainable development, the existence of that channel actually makes a big difference. When we talk about, again, the natural flow and the natural restoration of our areas that should be protected. In the long term, Brays Bayou will not look any different than it does now. That bayou will continue to stay in that channel. However, Buffalo Bayou cannot stay in that channel without anthropogenic contribution to that bayou, and of course the floodplain next door. So it means that those homeowners who are living next door to Buffalo Bayou would have to add concrete to their foundations to be able to stabilize their homes, since over time the silt that is along the banks of that bayou will naturally want to fall into the bayou and be washed away down to Galveston. So without public intervention, Buffalo Bayou's communities will change. And private people along the bayou will choose, some of them will choose to stabilize their foundations. Others will choose not to, for various reasons, because that's how we do things when we have a choice. Some of us will choose to leave from living along Buffalo Bayou, and the city may buy that property and turn it into floodway. So over time, I think we can actually see Buffalo Bayou's next door communities turning more into floodways or natural floodways than we will with regards to Brays Bayou communities. Those communities, again, will not suffer the fate of a natural system actually taking over and inundating those communities. And it is for that reason that the idea of buyouts perhaps would probably make more sense along Buffalo Bayou. Because, again, that is a bayou system that could be restored to its natural capability. But as a sustainable development expert, I would not feel comfortable getting up here advocating just an environmental context. Even though this is Earth Day and we are celebrating the environment, sustainable development was meant to tell us we need to be on equal footing and we need to have balance with social interests and economic interests. So it's very important for us to consider the communities there. and talk to those communities and work with those communities to come up with solutions that make sense for them, the environment, and our city's economic policy. And the last frame, I promise this is the last frame, and then you'll be freed from listening here to this technical jargon. The last frame is this frame with regards to again, the idea of how do we balance the three different pillars within sustainable development. On the social side, we cannot ignore the complexity of our communities, because our communities are made up of people and our kids and our loved ones, our friends and our families. They have needs. We have to sit down and come up with creative ways to support our communities. On the economic side, the cost burden is not an individual burden alone. And at this point, most of the communities I talk to seem to be thinking, you know what, we don't know what to do. The city is saying, you know what, we don't know what to do because we don't have a history of planning at this level. So individual homeowners are thinking, you know what, I think it's up to us, but we don't know what to do. And this is exactly where public support comes in. So our communities should really feel supported, feel comforted that it is actually not an individual responsibility, and it is very much a public responsibility. And again, teams like mine at Rice University are here to help. And as well, the community should recognize that when we talk about the economics, because it's not an individual burden, other systems are actually affected as well. What about our schools? Those are systems. What about, again, the wastewater treatment plants that our city manages? Those will be inundated also, and the city has to address those. What about the businesses that want to operate in these areas to cater to our needs? Those also need support. What about roadways that help us to get, to school, to business, to leisure? We need those as well, because it's quite frankly our only way of transport. Our communities are complex, and my team is working on this as best as we can. Lastly, on the environmental component, infrastructure spending is critical. We just heard a bill being released and decided on in Congress that will free up monies for FEMA to do an estimate, to do an assessment of the floodplain. So it's easier right now for elected officials to come up with monies for studies. But it's very difficult when we talk about coming up with monies for infrastructure, and specifically this type of infrastructure, for some reason. And I don't understand why personally. I'm actually challenged with that. And I think that has more to do with cultural norms, than it does with the reality of availability of the funding. For instance, why is it so much easier and efficient to get transportation funding than it is to get monies for our infrastructure? Again, because we don't have a tradition, or we don't have a way of doing that naturally. What about technology on this component? So I'm going to call a name. I know I don't normally do this, but Elon Musk, we need you in Houston. Zuckerberg, please help us here with the technology component. Or this new effort that we're having, again, with the mayor creating this technology village at Main Street, which Rice so gratefully donated that property for. We need to have technology also addressing this issue. A friend of mine just came from seeing Congress on a lobbying visit, and she walked into an office. I won't tell you who the office was because I'm not telling you who the person was. But the person says to her, "Oh yes, I know what you're here for. You need a third reservoir, you need a floodgate, and you need money for buyouts." Well, that's quite simplistic. And the fact that Congress knows that is saying to us that we're kind of respondent. We're kind of respondent again to rhetoric. Those are three big ticket items. But when are we going to get down to thinking at the community level, what are those small things that we can actually do to help, again, our communities and our people be more resilient in the face of this hazard that we're faced with, of flooding? And so lastly, I'd just like to leave you guys with this note. The environment is in our hands. We must be responsible. And from the sustainable development perspective, it means recognizing the needs for balance between the social considerations, economic considerations, and environmental considerations. Thank you very much for coming out today, and happy Earth Day, everyone. What do you think? Was that okay? How do you think? How did you